our topic for today is Arthur Goldberg. Now, you think he was Jewish? I mean, pretty Jewish name. Uh, he's actually probably, if you look at it from all the Supreme Court justices sort of lived their Jewish identity in different ways. But he was, at the end of his career, he was president of the American Jewish Committee for a couple of years. So he really had a strong Jewish element, and he was appointed by President Kennedy to succeed Felix Frankfurter in what had essentially become the Jewish seat. And this was the Jewish seat on the Supreme Court, although there were times when there were more than one Jew, but this traditionally had been filled. And so let me give you a little background about Arthur Goldberg, because it's very much a Chicago story. So he was born on the west side of Chicago. His parents were immigrants from Ukraine, and he was one of 11 kids.
Wow.
11 kids. Yeah. You probably know a little bit about the history of the west side of Chicago with Maxwell Street, but it was essentially a Chicago version of the Lower East Side. By 1930, there were 275,000 Jews in Chicago, and more than 80% lived on the west side by that. But now, essentially, people were moving, but it was a very, very concentrated Jewish area. There were more than 70 synagogues in that neighborhood. Can you imagine that? More than 70 synagogues on the west side. And it was a lot of peddlers, little delis, rooming houses, just kind of picture what you see from nostalgia on the Lower East Side. And that was essentially what was on the west side of Chicago. It's quite interesting. The early part of my career, maybe the first 10 years, when I would conduct funerals, I would quite often, the parent or the deceased would have met their wife or husband. I noticed it over and over again at the JPI, which was the Jewish People's Institute, which was kind of like a JCC before there were JCCs on the west side. Yes, Sue, go ahead.
Okay, so that's where my mother and father met.
There you go.
And my mother was raised on the west side and went to Marshall High School. My parents moved north, after they married, but they met at the JPI, which was the forerunner of the JCC, I believe.
Yes. It's amazing how many people would meet on dances at the JPI. I heard that over and over again at funerals I conducted. I don't hear it much anymore, unfortunately, because I think anyone who's met there has died, unfortunately. But it's an amazing story. Yes, Evie.
Yeah, he was in my mother's high school graduation class.
Wow.
I think there were not, in her particular school, there were not very many Jewish students, because she was called out for taking off on the Jewish holiday. And I remember her telling me that they asked her why she took off, on whatever the day was, Rosh Hashanah, and she said the same reason the other Jewish students took off. And they said, well, since when are you Jewish? Her name was Kasowitz. But many times she mentioned that he was in her graduating class.
That's fascinating. Yeah, he was a product of the west side. His father was a fruit salesman. He was a produce peddler. Not simple job. But unfortunately, his father died in 1916 while Goldberg was in high school. And so he had to take a lot of extra jobs to keep his family afloat. So he worked at Wrigley Field. He was the youngest. So he was the youngest in his family. And so he was allowed to continue to be in school. A lot of his siblings had to drop out of school because, they needed to work to support the family. But he was allowed to stay in school. And he worked various jobs, including as a vendor at Wrigley Field, and as a library clerk. And one of his closest friends was a future professional boxer named Jackie Fields. So this area of the West Side if you think about history, produced a lot of really interesting figures in American history, Jewish history. I mean, Benny Goodman, of course, somewhat interesting. If you ever want to read a fascinating book, it's called Super Mob, which is about Sidney Korshak, Sidney Korshak was the link between the Chicago machine and the mafia for 50 years, and he never ever got in trouble. He was sort of the cleanest of the clean, even though he was as corrupt. And his brother was Marshall Korshak, who was a public official, and they shared office. They had offices together, and one of them was sort of the ultimate mob fixer, and the other was a public official. This was a different period of Chicago history. But Sidney Korshak was from the West Side. That book is just fascinating. It's perhaps a little bit exaggerated. It's a little bit sensationalist, but quite interesting. So Arthur Goldberg ultimately graduates from high school. Yeah, go ahead, Evie. Yeah.
No, I wasn't saying anything.
Oh, you got your hand. Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
That's okay. So he gets interested in the law primarily because of a very, very famous trial in 1924. Does anybody know what that trial was? Testing your historical knowledge here. It was known as the trial of the century until maybe the OJ trial eclipsed it. But this was the trial of the century.
Was that the Leopold?
Yes, Leopold and Loeb.
Leopold and Loeb.
Who, of course, there are Loebs still in Chicago and Leopolds. These were two very smart Jewish kids from very successful German Jewish families in Hyde Park. And they believed they tried to commit the perfect murder, which they did. And there was no cause. They just wanted to see I guess the cause was to see if they could get away with it. And their parents hired Clarence Darrow, who represented them, who was sort of the greatest lawyer of the land. And Arthur Goldberg said his interest in the law was watching that trial. And Darrow, they were convicted, but Darrow prevented them from, getting the death penalty being applied in this case. And he would actually go, while he was in high school, Arthur Goldberg would go and watch the trial. So it had a tremendous influence on him. And then he got into Northwestern Law School, where he was an outstanding student, extremely high grade point average. One of the professors invited him to help him work on a book, which was published. I think it was the dean of Northwestern Law School. So he was he was just extremely, extremely bright, clearly. And then when he graduated law school, like many Jews at that time, he was not welcome at any of the high-powered Gentile law firms, including, today, Sidley and Austin, where Newton Minow was managing partner, a lot of Jewish managing partners. At that point, that was a blue chip, Gentile law firm that no Jew could really go to. So he became an associate at a small law firm with some pretty heavy hitter names called Pritzker and Pritzker, which was the two brothers. That time they weren't, they didn't own the Hyatt hotel chain. It was they were lawyers who then eventually got into real estate. But he worked there for a while, but he didn't like it. He was successful, but he didn't like foreclosing on people. He didn't like that process. He didn't like kicking people out of their homes, which was a big part of his job, especially as the Depression kicked in. And so then in 1933, he decides to go out on his own as a lawyer. And he's interested in this emerging field of labor law, which was not a big field back then. It's a big field now. But he saw that there were labor unions that were becoming more and more powerful, especially with FDR. And so he really believed, he wanted to, he was a New Dealer. He really believed passionately in Roosevelt's ideas, and he began to represent labor unions. And he formed some great contacts, but his big success came in 1938, where he represented the newspaper guild, which was part of the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, in a strike against William Randolph Hearst. And of course, we know about William Randolph Hearst, and he owned all these newspapers, and then became even more famous later with the kidnapping. But Goldberg successfully represented the employees of one of his newspapers, and they countersued him. He was aggressive. He countersued and ultimately won, and they were able to form a newspaper union called the Newspaper Guild. And so he impressed a lot of people with his success. And he ultimately then was invited to represent other labor unions like the United Steelworkers. And he then, in 1945, I'm jumping ahead, but we're going to go back to the war. 1945, he becomes general counsel for the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which essentially made him one of the leading labor lawyers in the country. But it all started with him forming his own little one-person law firm in the early 1930s. Now, the war was, of course, for many men of that period, I'm sure maybe some of your parents, or the World War II was a formative event of their lives, and it was true for Goldberg. He went in. He wanted to be in the Marines, but he wasn't in good enough shape. But he ultimately became part of the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which was the predecessor of the CIA. So this was a very prestigious. I mean, you had to be smart to get into the OSS. Another person who was involved in the OSS was Nelson Glick, who became the president of Hebrew Union College. But what Goldberg did was he was involved in the OSS in forming ties with labor unions in Europe. So he was using his labor contacts and his expertise the labor unions were generally against Hitler and against the authoritarian parties in Sweden, in all these places. He helped start a strike at a Swedish manufacturer that was secretly working with the Nazis. Sweden was ostensibly neutral, but there were groups that were pro-Nazi, and he helped start a strike to prevent a manufacturing in a Swedish area that was pro-Nazi. And he traveled all over Spain and France and Sweden and Europe during the war, cultivating these ties, and was enormously, I think, respected and successful in his role. And so he did that throughout the war. And he comes back after the war, and he comes back to Chicago, and he comes back to his law practice. And he ultimately becomes friendly with a young patrician, influential Chicagoan named Adlai Stevenson. And the two couldn't be different. I mean, Stevenson's, blue blood is blue blood. He had I think his grandfather was a vice president. So, and yet they formed a wonderful friendship, and they served on a committee together that was against the death penalty. Because, one of Arthur Goldberg's sort of seminal contributions, he was very anti-death penalty. And he wrote a very famous memo in the 1960s that helped justify the later overturning of the federal death penalty. So he forms a close tie with Adlai Stevenson, and his career as a labor lawyer continues to take off. He starts getting involved in domestic politics. I mean, labor unions were extremely influential. They're not as influential now, but especially after World War II, as they grew, and as American manufacturing grew, labor unions gained greater and greater power, and they were sort of a bedrock of the Democratic Party. So through his role as general counsel for the CIO, Goldberg meets John F. Kennedy. He meets Hubert Humphrey. He forms relationships with a lot of these figures. And perhaps most famously, what he does is in 1955, he's the one who engineers the merger between the CIO, where he was general counsel, and the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, which is the bigger labor union at the time. And he creates a merger, and it works. And so he becomes the general counsel for the AFL-CIO, which is an extremely important, labor union, probably the most at the time, especially. And in that role, he again continues to be respected as an extremely good negotiator. He's a lawyer, but he's a very, very effective bargainer. He can see things from multiple perspectives. He's respected by people on all sides, and he becomes very close to a lot of politicians. So then in 1960, he wants Adlai Stevenson to run again, although Stevenson had kind of been a loser. So Adlai Stevenson is not the guy. And Stevenson says, you should support Hubert Humphrey. But Goldberg says, you know what? I'm not going to. I'm going to support John F. Kennedy, which was a risk, as Humphrey was the favorite at the beginning. And he becomes Kennedy's labor advisor, which very important. And Kennedy is extremely impressed by him. And so Kennedy wins. So he bet on the right horse. He bet on, he supported the guy who won. And so he is appointed to the cabinet. He is appointed as the labor secretary. He's the first Jewish person in a cabinet in a long time. Eisenhower didn't have any Jews in his cabinet. So he is a labor secretary, and he's extremely effective as a labor secretary. I mean, he's really seen as really, I mean, I think Kennedy says he's the smartest one in my cabinet. He's organized, he's thoughtful, he's politically astute, as well as does what's right for unions and so forth. And so then Kennedy considers appointing him to the Supreme Court in 1961, but he decides not to. Then when Frankfurter retires in 1962, Kennedy says, this is the Jewish seat. And so Arthur Goldberg is appointed. And it's a major, it's wonderful. I mean, he's the fourth Jewish Supreme Court justice. So it's a big deal. And he is the first in a long time to actually have gone from the cabinet to the Supreme Court. It had been done twice before in the 1910s and 1920s, and then it happens to him and hasn't happened since. So he goes on to the Supreme Court. Now, his Supreme Court tenure is very short, and we're going to get to why that is. And you can be a very, very smart person, and you can make a couple of mistakes that are very detrimental. And that happened to Arthur Goldberg. It was a mistake, and he later admitted it to leave the Supreme Court. And we'll get to why that happened in a little bit. But on the Supreme Court, even though his tenure is short, he participates in a lot of very important decisions. One of them is called Griswold versus Connecticut. Who here has heard of that Supreme Court decision? Okay, Sue, and why is that decision famous? Go ahead.
I can't remember, but I know that I did know.
Yeah, okay. Know. It is the first decision that actually recognizes a right to privacy, which is not a right elaborated in the in the Constitution. You can variously read it from illegal search and seizure, preventing illegal search and seizure. There are ways you can derive a right to privacy, but it's even I think it was Harry Blackman who wrote the majority opinion. Even he said it was a stretch. But this right to privacy, which had to do with I think some sort of taping in somebody's private home that where there was a crime committed, but it was, was illegally obtained evidence, and this idea of a right to privacy was affirmed by the Supreme Court, and Goldberg helped write the majority opinion. And why that is so famous now is Roe versus Wade was decided on the basis of the right to privacy.
Right.
So now this is quite interesting that is potentially part of the reason it might have gotten struck down, because this right to privacy is a very weak thread. That's why some of the abortion people who are pro-choice really believe there should be some sort of constitutional amendment, because it rests on this right to privacy, which is very difficult to read into the Constitution. Anyways, that's not our subject for today, but he participated in that decision, of course, supporting the right to privacy, which was very important. Another decision he participated in, which was which made a big difference, was Escobedo versus Illinois. And this was an important decision because it established the right to an attorney present when you are questioned by the police. That was not a right before. And then ultimately that leads to the Miranda. We all know Miranda, you have a right to remain silent, That doesn't exist at this point either. But there was a case in Chicago where somebody was essentially coerced into confessing to a crime that they didn't commit, and they sued. And the idea was, if you have a right to, that there is a general, you cannot be wrongfully incriminated. You cannot incriminate yourself. And that then implied a right to counsel when you are questioned by the police. And Goldberg wrote the majority opinion in this case, which was attacked by police unions and others. I mean, he was attacked by some of his allies because it was seen as anti-police. But it has held up. And, if you, hopefully you haven't been in that situation, people can get questioned by the police for anything, but hopefully you haven't been in that situation. But if you've ever watched any of the, true crime shows, like Law and Order, you always know that having an attorney present is a big deal. And it is a significant right that Goldberg helped affirm. Another case that he was involved with was called Kennedy versus Mendoza Martinez, which was there was an immigration law passed in 1952. Now, remember, early 1950s is when there was communist hysteria in the United States, where people were afraid of communists everywhere. And by the way, interestingly, when Goldberg first started out as a labor lawyer, he joined a labor lawyers guild, a labor guild in the 1930s with several other labor attorneys. But he dropped out of that guild when it became clear that it had communist leanings. So he was very aware of certain portions of the labor movement were pro-communist, and he wanted nothing to do with that. And so he supported Joe McCarthy in McCarthy's early years. Then when he saw how crazy McCarthy had gotten, he withdrew. He was anti-McCarthy, but he was not a sympathizer. He was not a socialist sympathizer. He was a very sort of center of the road labor figure, and really believed in sort of that when owners benefit, labor should benefit, and everyone should benefit and do well, which is a wonderful way of looking at the world. So anyways, in 1952, there was a law passed that revoked citizenship for people who had been communists and had not given up their communism. That would revoke American citizenship. If they were found to have lied, their citizenship could be revoked. And it happened to somebody who then sued. And Goldberg wrote the opinion saying that's unjust. He doesn't have sympathy for these communist officials or communists, but revoking citizenship violated his sense of civil liberties. So these were just a few of the decisions he was involved with, but these were pretty major decisions. He was, this was a very consequential time for the Supreme Court. The 1960s and 1970s really were a time of a lot of major decisions. And Goldberg was very clear that he wanted to be an activist Supreme Court justice. He was different than Frank. He succeeded Frankfurter, whereas Frankfurter essentially was a fairly conservative Supreme Court justice. Even though in his legal career he was a liberal, as I talked about last week, as a Supreme Court justice, he was relatively conservative. He didn't really believe the court should be changing laws passed by Congress. Whereas Goldberg was very clear that he was a New Dealer. He was a big believer in FDR's ideas, and he believed that the Supreme Court should play a role in helping build the Great Society, as Johnson would later call it. So he was unabashed in his sort of liberalism on the court. He also, interestingly, he followed in the tradition of other Jewish justices in hiring Jewish law clerks. One of his law clerks was Stephen Breyer. Another one of them was Alan Dershowitz. He was somebody who actually, of his 8 law clerks, 6 of them were Jewish. So he clearly valued in bringing Jews, because most of the other justices didn't hire Jewish law clerks. The Jewish justices tended to hire Jewish law clerks. Now, here's where it gets quite interesting. He's appointed to the Supreme Court in 1962. In 1965, he resigns from the Supreme Court. Now, this is quite a mystery as to why he resigns. And the official line, so I looked into this question a lot, and there are a lot of different theories, but in 1965, Adlai Stevenson dies. And Lyndon Johnson is flying to his funeral on Air Force One, and he invites Goldberg to fly with him from Washington to Chicago for the funeral on Air Force One. And on Air Force One, Johnson persuades Goldberg to resign from the Supreme Court. Now, why on earth would Goldberg agree to do that? So, what? And then he would be appointed ambassador to the United Nations, because that's what Stevenson was, and Goldberg would take that position. But first, why would Johnson want that? So Johnson, who is one of the greatest politicians ever, wants to appoint his friend, Abe Fortas, who's also Jewish, to the Supreme Court. Why does he want to appoint Abe Fortas? Because he thinks Abe Fortas will tell him in advance of any impending Supreme Court decisions that threaten Johnson's agenda. He thinks Abe Fortas, who we all already know is ultimately a bit of a criminal, not awful kind of crime, but Abe Fortas is not the most ethical person. He ultimately has to resign from the Supreme Court because of that. But he says Abe Fortas will give him insider intelligence about what the Supreme Court is deciding. So he wants his friend Abe Fortas. So how does he persuade Arthur Goldberg to resign? Well, Arthur Goldberg was very opposed to the war in Vietnam already at that point. And what biographers say is that Johnson said, as UN ambassador, you can help end the war in Vietnam. You can use I'm sure he complimented him. You're the greatest negotiator in the world. You can use your skills to tamp down the war in Vietnam. And he appealed to Goldberg's ego. Goldberg really believed, I think he really believed that he could help end the war in Vietnam. That if he were in the United Nations, if he were part of Johnson's cabinet, and he insisted that the UN ambassador would be a cabinet role, he believed that he could use his skills of persuasion to end the war, which of course he was wrong to think that, but that's possibly what he believed, or that's what he says he believed. So that's what he says helped motivate his decision, was he think, I can be on the Supreme Court, or I can help end this awful war. I'm going to take a risk and help end this awful war. That's one theory. Another theory is that he believed that when FDR ran, or not, when LBJ ran for re-election in 1968, which he ultimately did not do, but he didn't know at the time, that he would choose Goldberg to be his vice president, and he would be the first Jewish vice president in the United States. Now, it's unclear if LBJ ever made overtures to that effect, or other people whispered that in Arthur Goldberg's ear. But that was also that's what one of his biographers suggested, that there was an understanding that Goldberg could very well be a vice presidential nominee, because he was his ties to organized labor were so strong that with him on the ticket, it's having a great asset. So that might have been part of his calculation. A third possibility was he believed that Johnson would reappoint him as Chief Justice when the current, I forget who the Chief Justice, there must have been Warren Burger. When Warren Burger retired, that Johnson would reappoint him to the Supreme Court as Chief Justice. Johnson may have made that promise. It may have been something that they implicitly, was in the air. So all of those might have been behind the decision that he agreed. Now, you know what it also could have just been? It could have just been that LBJ wore him down and persuaded him. That LBJ was famous for that. Although it takes a lot to give up a Supreme Court seat. But he does. He becomes the first justice in a long time to resign from the Supreme Court after only 3 years. And then he becomes ambassador to the United Nations. And he plays an important role as ambassador. He helps negotiate, he helps write the protocols that end the 6-Day War. We know the 6-Day War, which Israel wins in 6 days, and Israel's territory grows massively. And there's a sort of, it's not a treaty because it's not a peace agreement, but it's sort of a set of protocols that everyone agrees to. And as part of those protocols, it says Israel will withdraw from the territories. But Arthur Goldberg pointed out, it doesn't say Israel will withdraw from all the territories. It just says Israel withdraw from the territories. So that Arthur Goldberg actually wrote later about how he deliberately took the word all out. He understood that there would have to be some sort of negotiated peace later, which would not mean Israel would go back to 1967 lines. He also he does several things as ambassador. He helps negotiate a peace agreement in Africa, which helps prevent a war. He's a very effective ambassador. But then Johnson loses. Well, he decides not to run for re-election, and Richard Nixon becomes president. And so Arthur Goldberg leaves his position at the United Nations. Some people say that Johnson asked Nixon to reappoint Goldberg to the Supreme Court, but Nixon had no interest in doing that. So what he does, Goldberg leaves and he goes and he becomes senior counsel at a very large, prestigious New York law firm called Paul Weiss, which was known for having a lot of political powerhouses at the law firm. And, he's like a rainmaker. He brings in big clients because he's pretty famous. He's a former Supreme Court justice. But he's not happy. He's bored. And so he decides to run for Senate against Nelson Rockefeller as a Democrat in New York. And initially, people think he's a great candidate, that he has name recognition. He has a lot of great contacts. He's respected in the labor movement. So he runs for Senate in 1972 and he gets crushed. He just loses big time. And the reason is he sort of is just, he's maybe kind of like Dr. Oz. He's not a New Yorker. He moves to New York after living in Chicago and Washington, D.C. He confuses in one speech in Manhattan. He says, it's great to be in Brooklyn. And so if you are in Manhattan and you say it's great to be in Brooklyn, that's not a good move. symbolically. And he's just not a good politician. He doesn't connect with people, and he doesn't run a good campaign. So he just loses by a lot. And at this point, he's kind of, this is where he writes about how he regrets that he left the Supreme Court. He didn't achieve any of what he had hoped he might achieve for leaving the Supreme Court. He doesn't create peace in Vietnam. Ultimately the war ends. He doesn't gain any more influential office. He's relatively unhappy, but he's a well-known figure. So at this point, he becomes the president of the American Jewish Committee, which was a great coup for the committee to have him as president. And he's well respected. He's a good fundraiser. He's very pro-Zionist, and he has, being former ambassador to the United Nations is a tremendous asset because, at that point, Zionism was a hot issue before the United Nations. That was when the Zionism is Racism resolution was around. So he plays a role, and then he does that for 2 years, and then essentially he goes back to private law practice. And his firm, which he had started in Chicago, ultimately becomes the law firm of 2 other fairly famous Chicago Jews. One of them is Abner Mikva. So the Arthur Goldberg's firm, ultimately Ab Mikva is a partner in it before he runs for Congress. And so is Milton Shader, who was a member of our synagogue for a period of time, who then becomes a federal judge. He was a partner. And that's what Goldberg does for the rest of his career. He's an attorney in Chicago, and he writes kind of about his regrets. I think he writes that it was not smart of him to trust LBJ, that he would be reappointed, or that he had a chance of going back to the Supreme Court, and that he had too much trust in that. He had 2 kids. One of them was named Robert Goldberg, and Robert Goldberg is, I looked him up. He retired. He was a lawyer practicing in Anchorage, Alaska. Why he moved to Alaska, I don't know. But he was a lawyer practicing in Alaska. And he continued. He was like his father, a labor lawyer. He also had a daughter, Barbara. I couldn't find very much information about them. But he is he's just really continued to be respected by labor unions. He's part of the Labor Hall of Fame, along with many other Jews. He taught at the University of Chicago for a while. He continues to sort of be. He even intervened in the Metropolitan Opera strike at a period of time. So he continues to use his legal influence, but it's never the same. His sort of career peaked in probably the 60s when he was, a cabinet official and then a Supreme Court justice. So that's a little bit of the story of Arthur Goldberg. It's quite, if you look at it from a historical perspective, it is his life in some ways illustrates the historical significance of second-generation American Jews. So second generation, you could call them second or first generation. Generally, I say second because his parents did live in America. His parents weren't born in America. This is a controversy among sociologists. Is a first generation the one that's born here or the ones that immigrate here? But let's just say he's a second generation American Jew. So he's born in a very ethnic neighborhood with immigrant parents. He succeeds magnificently in public school, and then he really forges a life as a very pro-American, successful, part of the greatest generation. Those who fought in World War II, came back to the United States, helped make the United States a great country, were very pro-Israel, this is that greatest generation, which we know about. If sadly, most of them have died. Most of them have died. There's a few left. But he was he was part of that, and he really exemplified the American Jewish success story, even with all his failures, and really a great kind of Chicago story as well. Who has questions? Yeah, Brenda.
Did any of his siblings reach not his degree of success, but some success?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I don't think so, though. I mean, in all the reading I did, his siblings weren't really discussed at all. I think a couple of them died early, from what I remember reading somewhere. But no, it's a very good question. I will try to find out the answer to that and let you know next week, because I'm curious too. Yeah, I don't know much about his siblings. Other questions? Yeah, Marilyn. No, can't hear you. Yeah, unmute. Yeah.
There we go. He did win the Presidential Medal for
Yes.
Freedom. That was quite an award for a Jewish lawyer who had trouble finding a job in the first place, being a Jew, to end up. So he must have been very proud of that. And then another thing I read about him was that he got the highest grades ever at Northwestern University.
Oh.
And any lawyer, and like my uncle, who was one of the youngest people to ever take the bar. My uncle was had to take care of his mother and his sister, and he had to also get permission to take the bar before he was 21. And he was the first to do that. And the same with and with Goldberg, he was 18, and he won. He was able to take the bar at 18. So there are some very wonderful stories about people who passed the bar long before.
Amazing. Yeah, I mean, yeah, he was brilliant. He was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by Jimmy Carter in 1978.
And what about Kennedy? What did Kennedy had something to do with his being.
Kennedy. He was Kennedy. So he. I think I mentioned that at the beginning. So Kennedy in 1960. He took a risk and supported Kennedy for president against Hubert Humphrey before others endorsed Kennedy. And so he became Kennedy's labor advisor. And Kennedy was very impressed by him, said he was the smartest man in my cabinet. He appointed Goldberg Secretary of Labor. And so Kennedy really was his political mentor. And I think part of that was because he was so connected to labor, and labor was huge back then. It was the sort of bedrock of the Democratic Party. And so he had a lot of influence at that point.
And then one more question. You said he ran for Senate. I thought he ran against Rockefeller for governor.
No, Senate.
He said that.
Yeah. Did I say? Yeah, no, for Senate.
You told us that already, Rabbi.
Yeah, no, he said he ran for Senate, but I thought it was governor.
No, I'll double check. I'm pretty sure it was
lost to Rockefeller for governor.
Rockefeller. You're right. My mistake. You're right. In 1970, he ran for governor against Rockefeller, and he lost in a landslide. Yes. So it was 1970. Yes, that was my mistake. I was thinking of J. Rockefeller, who was a senator from West Virginia. He ran against Nelson Rockefeller for governor, and he lost. People were hopeful at first. People thought he's so well known. New York's a Democratic state. He could win, but he lost.
Right.
Other questions? Anything else? He was, it's quite an interesting story. You think about somebody who attains the position as Supreme Court Justice and then resigns, and makes you wonder sort of about how we make decisions, you know, and what would anything have been different had he stayed on the Supreme Court? Oh, I forgot to mention this. This is very important, very important. He was adamantly opposed to the death penalty.
Oh, right.
And he wrote a memo in 1967. He had no opportunity on the Supreme Court to vote on the death penalty. But he wrote a very thorough memo with Alan Dershowitz. Alan Dershowitz helped him write this memo when Dershowitz was already, he had been his clerk. Now Dershowitz was a teacher at Harvard Law School. And they wrote a very strong argument against the death penalty. But then Goldberg left the court, and but his memo was cited, I think it was 1972 or 1973, when the Supreme Court officially declared the death penalty unconstitutional. And that was a great moment for Arthur Goldberg. Of all his issues, he was passionate about the death penalty. He believed that it hurt innocent people, was unnecessary, and that might have gone all the way back to that original Clarence Darrow and Leopold and Loeb, and his being persuaded about the unjustness of it. And that is, you know, obviously it's still a very interesting issue. I mean, you know, there are people who are passionately opposed to the death penalty for a variety of reasons. One of them is that the state should never be able to take somebody's life. That is such a kind of fundamental right. You can punish somebody, of course, for crimes, but taking somebody's life it's not something that a government has any sort of role, should have any sort of role in doing. Other comments or questions? Yeah, Sue?
Well, I think it's very interesting from the Jewish point of view, because so often we read in the Torah how people are commanded by God to kill.
Yes.
But I look at it totally differently. I look at it as thinking of the 10 commandments, and thou shalt not kill.
Right.
And that what right does a human being have to take the life of another person who has done you personally no harm?
Right.
Even if they have, you still don't have a right to kill them.
That's right. Well, the Jewish view of the death penalty is very interesting. So clearly, the Torah does establish a death penalty. You know, lex talionis, he who takes a life, his life shall be taken, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, so forth. However, Rabbinic Judaism made the death penalty very, very difficult to actually inflict. So what they did was they said, if you are going to apply the death penalty, you have to have 2 witnesses who testify to the crime. And not only do they have to testify the exact same thing, they have to use the exact same words in their testimony. So they have to say precisely the same thing. And it has to be premeditated. You know, they set all these conditions that essentially make it impossible. And then according to, I think it was either Hillel or Kiba, the death penalty was applied once every 70 years, if that. So essentially, they made it impossible to actually carry out, that is a common technique with rabbinical Judaism, is if there's a law they don't like, they make the application of that law they set the threshold so high that it never happens. Excellent point. One other interesting fact. Yeah, go ahead, Sue. Yeah.
No, I was just gonna, no, I'd rather hear interesting things from you than what I was just gonna say.
The only interesting thing that I was going to say was Arthur Goldberg was he was affirmed to the Supreme Court by the Senate 99-1.
Wow.
And you know who the one vote against him was?
Strom Thurmond.
You got it. That's right. That's exactly right. Strom Thurmond, who is at that point still a Democratic senator from South Carolina. And looks like he was an anti-Semite, or he didn't like labor unions, or all of the above.
And he was a segregationist.
Yes, yep. So that's a nice history. Yeah.
So what I was going to just say, just as a little aside, is that talk about the Leopold and Loeb case. My grandfather was the chairman of the board of Hillman's and Stop and Shop and Gator's Catering Service in Chicago. Actually, he was my step grandfather, but he was really like a grandpa. And one of his partners was from the Loeb family.
Very interesting. Very interesting.
And they were really that family was having to live that down, what their relative had done.
Yeah, I mean, it's for sure. It's sort of tainted. It tainted the family. It tainted the Chicago Jewish community. I mean, it was. I remember when I was at Sinai, I once got a call from somebody who was writing a book about the Leopold and Loeb case because they were members of Temple Sinai.
Mhm.
It was in Hyde Park. It was where the German Jews were, yeah, that was a fun phone call. Yeah, yeah. Evie, go ahead. Yeah.
They actually had a compound in Highland Park, and I think it was not too far from the library where that was their summer place. And until a few years ago, we used to belong to a walking group from Common Ground when it was in existence, when it was a little bit more vibrant. We used to walk like every Tuesday morning, and a group of us and so forth. And one of the ladies that I just adored who was in that group was one of the Loeb ladies. And I have to tell you, the most philanthropic, I mean, she was so into encouraging reading, did not believe in having a television in her home or any appliances and so forth. I mean, she was just so refreshing to be around. Obviously, we didn't talk about the history, but she did keep that part of her name very, very much out there.
Yeah, that's yeah. No, I've done funerals of people who are, sort of part of the family, extended. Yes, that German Jewish community was extraordinary, intellectual, philanthropic, just exactly what you just said. But I guess any community, there's a few bad apples. That's it's but that was a very, I mean, I just did the funeral for a wonderful guy named Tom Horwich. The Bernard Horwich JCC is his grandfather. They joined, they knew me from Sinai, but they joined Macomb because I had a wonderful relationship with them. And both his parents went to University of Chicago, and so these were smart people. It's probably a little intimidating to grow up in that kind of environment, the University of Chicago, with sort of an illustrious family name, and then two parents who go to the University of Chicago. But this was an extraordinary community, done a lot of good for the city and for the Jewish community. Yeah, it's a wonderful history. Unfortunately, or fortunately, as generations change, some of those old lines that we had of German Jews and Eastern European Jews, and those kind of fade away over time. But the history of it is really extraordinary. Any other questions or comments? Yeah.
I have a funny story about that. No relationship, okay? But not too long ago, somebody did ask if we were related, and I said, no, not. Yeah, and I said, no, not at all. And he said, well, he is distantly related, but he doesn't get a discount either.
Yeah. I forgot that. That's right. That's your last name. That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
No relationship.
He was a wonderful guy. He was a very gentle, kind, just at first I got to know him because he asked me when I was, just out of rabbinical school, invited me to go to the Holocaust Museum lunch with him. And then we just got to talking and just became good friends. And in fact, he had a funny story. I love this. I told it at the funeral. He was president of Northmore in the early 1980s. And at that point, Northmore was open on Rosh Hashanah. So it's a Jewish country club. And he said, he got it to, he said, we're going to close on we're going to close on the Jewish high holy days, even if not everyone's going to synagogue. And he had a lot of opposition. There were a lot of guys who said, no, it's a what, but he closed, which I thought was just a great story. Sue, do you have your hand up? Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. Next week,
Thank
we'll
you.
look at Abe Fortas. Oh, Diane, did you have something?
No, I'm just saying goodbye. I have to run.
Good. Goodbye, everybody. We'll look at Abe Fortas next week.
This was really a good meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great session.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.